Hi MS translators, it's Brett here, back for another live video. I thought I would do a live video today to discuss the results of the recently published Ocrelizumab clinical trial. Now there's a couple of trials ongoing with that. This is the one looking at it compared to placebo in a group of people with primary progressive MS. Now, late last week, we published a short summary that I wrote regarding the background to why Ocrelizumab may be beneficial in primary progressive MS, and also a little bit about the study design. So if you haven't read that and want to have a look at it, if you just flick through here, if you go to the MStranslate website, you can see here front and center on the homepage we have the article, and if you click through to that, here's all of that information that I was talking about in terms of that background and study design. So just to go through that really briefly before I get onto the results, essentially what Ocrelizumab does is that it depletes B cells. It's a therapy that's a monoclonal antibody therapy that's designed to deplete B cells, and there's evidence to suggest that B cells may be involved in the progression of MS, including in primary progressive MS. Now, there's a few different therapies around at the moment that do similar things, and one of them that's been talked about a little bit is rituximab. Now, there are some slight differences in terms of how the two are made, Ocrelizumab and rituximab, and the exact part of the B cells that they target, but similar sort of treatments. And so rituximab was used in a clinical trial for people with primary progressive MS as well, and it didn't meet its clinical endpoints. Essentially, it was unsuccessful in meeting the goals that it was trying to achieve. But what was noticed when these results were analysed was that in a subgroup of people within the trial, rituximab actually looked like it was successful. And this is what I've talked about in the article that's up on the website at the moment, is that the trial design for the Ocrelizumab trial was designed with that in mind, and using the same sort of subgroup of people and targeting the same sort of subgroup of people that rituximab was shown to be more effective in. And so we keep that in mind as we go through, and we actually had, just before I've come online, a question on the Facebook page regarding that, and I'll get to that at the end of this video. So what I'm going to do now is go through the results in the paper, and the paper again. So here is the paper. Now this paper is actually freely accessible, so you can actually go, if you search for it, you should be able to get to this page. It's been published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and so anyone can actually go in and look through this. If you want to have a look for yourself and all of the different stuff that they talk about, you can do that. The other advantage of that is that as I go through and talk about this, because it is all freely accessible, I'm going to bring up some of the figures on the screen so that I can show you the sort of things that I'm talking about when I'm discussing the results that they've shown. So again, this is mentioned a little bit in the article on the website, but in terms of what they were looking at, their primary endpoint here was looking at clinical progression confirmed over a 12-week period. So they were looking to see what proportion of people either taking Ocrelizumab or taking placebo would progress in terms of their EDSS. And we've talked about that a little bit before, but it's essentially a way of measuring disability across the course of the trial. And so their primary one was looking at an increase in disability for a 12-week period. So if we look just really quickly, firstly, we can just see, and I'll just flick this again, bear with me while I'm doing this. So this is just sort of the first figure that you'll see if you go and look at the paper. So this just lists, if I use the mouse to show you what's going on, this just lists all of the different measures that they used for the trial, and then you can see here the different figures in terms of the numbers, the raw numbers of people that had a change, the percentage, and then the significance. And so when we're looking at p-values here, we're generally looking at a p-value of less than 0.05 to say that it's a statistically significant result. So when we're talking about this primary endpoint, or the main goal that they were looking at, what we're interested in is this top line here. So we can see that this is the disability progression for 12 weeks. And so if I just get a little bit closer to this, and apologize for the shaking, what you can see is the people who were taking Ocrelizumab, of the 487 people taking it, 160 progressed and had this progression confirmed at 12 weeks for a 12-week period, which was about 33% of the group. Whereas on placebo, it was 96 out of the 244, so about 39, a bit over 39%. So if we look at that graphically, and what might make it a bit easier to look at, and I'll show this, and I'll just zoom this in a little bit so that you can see a bit better what's going on, is that this top figure here is really what we're looking at in terms of this 12-week progression, so that we can see that without worrying too much about the specifics of what they're showing here in terms of how they've graphed it, we can see that across the time period of the study, the number of people, or the percentage of people on placebo who showed this progression was higher in the placebo group than the Ocrelizumab group. Now again, if we remember those raw numbers that I was sort of talking about when I showed that table, it was a difference of about 40% of patients on the placebo versus 33% taking Ocrelizumab. So it's not a huge difference, but this was statistically significant in terms of the difference between the two groups. If we scroll down, they then also went on to look at confirmed 24-week progression, so out to a slightly longer time point in terms of what they were looking at. Again, we can see that there was a difference between the two groups. So here we can see that more people in the placebo group showed this versus the Ocrelizumab group. This was a slightly less big difference between the two groups, but again, this was statistically significant in terms of what they saw. So that was sort of the main things that they were looking at. Really what they've shown from that is that people with primary progressive MS who were on Ocrelizumab versus taking a placebo didn't progress as much in terms of their EDSS, or a lower percentage of people progressed anyway. So they also looked at a couple of other measurements, and I'll bring those up in a second. So the next thing that they were looking at, if I go back again, was a few different measurements on MRI, and I'll zoom in again a little bit just to make this a bit easier to see. So what we're looking at in this top graph here is the lesion volume. So across the course of the trial, what we can see is obviously at 0 time point, so before the trial had started, there was no difference in terms of the lesion volume, or the average lesion volume between the two groups. But across the course of the trial, what we can see is that those on the placebo, the lesion volume increased, whereas those on Ocrelizumab, the lesion volume actually not only didn't increase, but actually decreased. And so this was a highly significant result, as shown here. Now, in terms of what this actually means clinically, we're still not really sure about that, but a decrease in lesion volume was something that they did report with Ocrelizumab. If I scroll down now to look at this one, so this is looking at decrease in brain volume. And so this is something that we know, or something that's been focused on more recently in terms of MS research, is that while for a long time we've focused on lesion numbers and lesion load and lesion volume, another thing that we need to be really aware of is brain volume. And so trying to preserve brain volume is something that especially newer treatments are really looking at being able to do. So what we're looking at here is a decrease in brain volume across the course of the study. And what we can see is that for those on the placebo, that decrease in brain volume was slightly more than those taking ocrelizumab, suggesting potentially that ocrelizumab can also slow the rate of brain volume loss. Now, looking at these results, it's been classified as statistically significant, but I think we can see here that this isn't a major difference between the two groups. Now, whether if we extended this out longer, beyond 120 weeks, whether we would see a bigger difference between the two groups, potentially long term, this small difference that we see would be even greater. We're not sure at the moment, but that's another thing that they reported. They showed that statistically anyway, ocrelizumab appears to be able to decrease the rate of brain volume loss. Going back to me now, the last thing that I want to talk about, they also did looked at the effect of ocrelizumab on the time 25-foot walk, 25 feet walk, which is a often used measure in clinical trials for MS to measure disability, and they showed that again that people on ocrelizumab performed better in this, or didn't decrease in their performance as much as those who weren't on ocrelizumab across the time of the trial. Now, obviously, one of the biggest things that we're interested in when we see new treatments coming out is how safe are they. So just want to spend a little bit of time finishing this off talking about the safety issues that were reported as part of this paper. So if we look at, and I'll just zoom in on this before I bring it up. If I just flick the paper, what we can see here is the different adverse events that were reported. And so we can see that across the time period of the trial, there was a large number of adverse events that did occur in both groups. So 95% of the people on ocrelizumab and 90% of the people reported some form of adverse event. If we go down a little bit, we can see that most of these adverse events were listed as mild or moderate, and a couple of severe. A number of reactions to the infusion, which was slightly higher in the people taking ocrelizumab versus the people that were on placebo. There were 4 deaths in the ocrelizumab group, so less than 1%, related to a couple of people that died of pneumonia. One person died of cancer, and there was the one death in the placebo group was an automobile accident. So, we can see that the risk of infection, if we look down here, if you can see this wasn't much higher in the ocrelizumab group versus the placebo group in terms of serious infections. But perhaps, flick back to me now, perhaps the biggest safety concern to come out of this, saying that the other ones are probably manageable, is that they did report, or there were a number of cases of cancer in the ocrelizumab group. So just as I'm reading through here, in the ocrelizumab group, 11 of the 486 patients, so what equated to about 2.3%, did develop some form of cancer during the trial phase, and that was compared to 2 of 239, or less than 1%, in the placebo group. And it is mentioned that after the trial phase, another 2 cases were detected in people taking ocrelizumab. Now, what they've said is that they've analysed this compared to what they've seen in data based for other treatments. So it's slightly confusing the way that they've talked about it, but they're listed it as the incidence of a first cancer among people with MS treated with ocrelizumab is 0.4 per 100 patient years of exposure. So essentially, an incidence of 0.4 if we equate that to if we have 100 patient years of exposure. Compared to if we think about something or data that we have for interferon beta or placebo groups that we have, that's at about 0.2 per 100 patient years of exposure. So they are reporting an increased risk at the moment from what they have. Now they go on to say that this obviously warrants further investigation, something that clearly needs to be monitored during the open label phase, and also to look at whether or not this is being seen with any of the other similar B-cell therapies that are being tested at the moment. They do report, interestingly, that no cases of PML have been reported so far with ocrelizumab, which we know has been a problem with other MS treatments in the past. So in terms of what we're looking at for these results, I think that the results, just to sort of sum up the video, I think that the results are interesting, they're exciting. And they're exciting really they're exciting when we keep it in the context of knowing that currently there have been no approved therapies for primary progressive MS or for progressive MS, and none that have been successful in any clinical trials before, so none that have shown any sort of benefits. Now, hopefully what you've seen from this video, and as we've walked through all of the results from this, and I apologise for the length of the video, but I wanted to make sure that we went through it thoroughly, and hopefully it does explain a bit if you've managed to survive to this point of the video in terms of staying engaged. But what you've seen is that there are benefits, and that they have seen benefits to people. It's not a cure, as has been reported. Often when things like this come out, it gets reported as the new wonder drug. It's not a cure, but we are seeing benefits to people with primary progressive MS, and so that's fantastic. In terms of the safety aspect, obviously the increased cancer risk needs to be investigated further. That will be weighed up by the FDA when they when they go into looking as to whether or not they will give approval for it. My gut feeling at the moment, and I mentioned this in the prediction article I did, is that it will be approved, purely based on the fact that it's the first treatment to have shown success, and the fact that there's nothing else out there. And so I think that alone will really help get it across the line in terms of approval, and that they will continue to monitor that cancer risk. In closing, just to finish up, the question that was asked on Facebook was really based around the stuff that I talked about at the very start, in terms of would rituximab have been successful or as successful as ocrelizumab if they'd designed their trial in the same way. It's an excellent question, one that I can't really give an answer to because we don't know. We'd have to do that trial. There's certainly a chance that rituximab would have been more successful if they'd designed that trial knowing that the subgroup of people who would benefit most from it. And I would be surprised if they're not looking into doing that now as a follow-up study. There is some evidence from other studies that have been done that, based on the way that ocrelizumab and rituximab have been designed, that ocrelizumab is slightly more effective and actually has less of a risk of treatment resistance developing. So I think the prior evidence suggests that ocrelizumab may be a slightly more effective therapy anyway, but whether rituximab may reach its clinical endpoint goals in a clinical trial with slightly different patient selection, definitely possible. Will be interesting to see whether or not they they follow that up with a trial, and if they do, whether or not they report that same safety risks or the slightly increased cancer risk that we're seeing with Ocrelizumab. All right, so hopefully that's helped explain what we've seen from this Ocrelizumab study. As I said, it's really exciting. It'll be interesting to see what comes next of it. We'll make sure that we keep you updated. If you have any questions on anything that I've said in this video or on anything that was written in the prior article, feel free to drop them in the comments section below, and I'll be more than happy to respond to you. All right, thanks guys, bye.